Order the Finance and Governance Committee for September 14th and roll call and posting of the agenda.
Chair Zaragoza,
Here.
Member Tehran,
Here.
And I'm sure that Councilman Basu is going to share with us or come in a few minutes. Please join me to salute the flag of the United States of America. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice. Thank you. And just to share with you on item B, we don't have any public comments today. So our next item is the consent item, which is the city clerk and approval of the minutes, that the Finance and Governance Committee approve the minutes of June 22nd and July 13 regular meeting. Okay, comments, Councilman Tehran, any questions and concerns?
No questions, Chair.
Okay, so make a motion to approve.
I will second.
Roll call.
Member Tehran,
Yes.
Chair Zaragoza.
Yes.
Thank you. Motion passes 2-0.
Thank you. Our next item is item D, reports to the Finance Department Audit Committee training by ADN Payne. Recommendation that the Finance and Governance Committee receive a training presentation from ADN Payne on the roles and responsibility of the Audit Committee. And this is going to be a live presentation. I think I see, let me see.
Mary,
Basu
are you able to
just
share
joined
the
us.
slides? Hopefully. There you go.
Okay.
Yeah,
Go
so
ahead.
Mayor, we have Mary, Hong, and Eden here with us from Eden Payne, and they'll be presenting.
Okay, Mary, thank you.
Okay. So I just lost my notes. Oh, there you go. Okay, so good evening, everyone, members of the Finance and Governance Committee, members of the public and management. This is session number 3 on our series of training of the Finance and Governance Committee. Tonight we'll be going over internal control and compliance. Next slide, please. This is a quick summary of the items that we'll be going over. We're going to try to explain to you what internal control exactly is, your responsibility as it relates to internal controls, a little bit more in depth, the technical aspects of internal controls, its limitations. We'll also discuss compliance related areas, and then the audit findings. Next slide. What is internal control? Internal control and the internal control framework was established and developed by COSO actually all the way back in 1992. You might have heard about internal control over the years as it relates to Sarbanes-Oxley, as it relates to our audits. But this concept it's not a new concept. It was a concept and framework that was established because there was a need from senior executives of large corporations that needed assistance in a way for them to understand and better control their large enterprises. This frameworks provides a basic guidance in assisting with this. So as you can read, the definition actually is internal control is a process affected by an entity's board of directors, management, and other personnel designed to provide reasonable assurance regarding the achievement of objectives relating to operations, reporting, and compliance. COSO. So this framework was developed by COSO. It's a commission or the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Threat Rate Commission, which was actually established and sponsored by 5 professional organization, accounting, finance organizations. And they researched this, they came up with this framework, and with the input from their stakeholders, the public and various professionals and academia, they established certain guidelines and principles. The concept of internal control has continued to evolve since 1992, especially with Sarbanes-Oxley being in effect in 2002. They realized how important it is, and they continue to develop it also to match it to changing times, changing operations, globalization of organizations. And they came up with a more updated version of the framework in 2013 with additional principles, the 17 principles that we are discussing tonight. Because this framework was very well developed, actually a lot of other organizations used it to adopt to use as their internal control framework, and you'll see similar concepts and principles as used by the GAO in their Green Book, as well as the SEO. They published the California State Controller's Office, California SEO. They published their internal control guidelines in 2015. So it's a well-established framework. Also, Oxnard established and adopted your own internal control framework or internal control integrated framework. You might have heard of it, ICIF, as a result of our audits and our findings in September 2020. You have an internal control framework that the city is using, and the city manager is in control of, and you as a board of oversight have governance over. Along with the internal control ICIF framework, you also have updated policies and procedures as it relates to internal controls. Our role as your auditor is to assess your internal controls in place and make you aware of any potential deficiencies. As you might have realized over the years, when we first started, there were a lot of deficiencies, but those all have been resolved since last audit. We do not sufficiently test your controls to issue an opinion on effectiveness. So there's a difference between just assessing internal controls in place and testing of internal controls and issuing an opinion. That would be a separate engagement if management were to find that certain controls in a particular area they think are very well established and they want that additional assurance. We would be able to do that, but that's not what we currently do. And then as it relates to internal controls, implementation should be scaled according to each organization based on their size and activities, and it could impact various departments across the whole organization. Next slide. Any questions?
No, go ahead.
Okay, next slide, please. So to bring you an overview of the types of internal controls that you might have, we have listed the 3 types here, which are preventative controls, detective controls, and corrective controls. I'd like to give you some examples for context. So the preventative controls are exactly what it sounds like. They are put in place to prevent errors or irregularities. And the type of controls that you might think of, very straightforward controls, are things like physical controls, like locks on doors. Things are you making sure that things can't be stolen. Password protection, as you are looking at accounting systems in place, things how your finances has been recorded. Having a basic pass or a secure password to your systems could prevent errors and irregularities. Detective controls are designed to find errors after they have occurred. Detective controls could be automated or manual. An example of a manual control would be, for example, a report, a management inspection of a report. They have to manually review it and sign off on the review. Is a manual control. An automated control could be any error reporting that a system might do on a day-to-day basis or a monthly basis. Corrective controls are to correct errors that are found by the detective internal controls. What you can think of as corrective controls are things like backup of your IT system. If you had a crash and you lost information, that backup is a corrective control that then reestablishes your information to correct the error that occurred. Next slide, please. Or any questions?
Council members, any questions, committee members? Okay, go ahead.
So to then go over the responsibilities of the audit committee. Your primary responsibilities relate to two areas as it relates to the audit committee. It's your knowledge of the system of internal controls over financial reporting, and then your knowledge of the system of internal controls over the city's compliance with laws, regulations, contracts, grant agreements, and abuse and operations. You oversee the city's internal control environment directly as its board of governance. And then you also oversee the city's ethics and compliance program. What you might think of here specifically is as it relates to your internal control environment and your ethics and compliance program. Internal control environment, the council or the FGC, the Finance and Governance Committee is in charge of hiring the internal auditor and is in charge of monitoring the fraud and abuse hotline. So any reporting that comes from those, either the consultant or the hotline, the consultant that manages the hotline, you get a direct report relating to their findings, and you have to decide. You might have to decide if any further action is needed in response to those findings.
Hong, question?
Yes.
How often should we have an auditor look at that, the system internal control and other controls? How often should we look, an auditor look at that?
So we, as your external auditors, we do
Right.
look at your, we do assess your internal controls annually.
Annually?
Your internal auditors in the past have done special projects. So, or followed up with any leads from the hotline.
Okay.
So that is more on an as needed basis. How you've done it in the past, but you can formalize it as much as you want to.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So then the last point we have noted here is, as your responsibility as the audit committee is to apply skepticism in validating the information received. So information received, this could be information that you receive from management as it relates of their knowledge and their findings as it relates to internal controls, but this could also be the public, as you might can connect that to the hotline, for example, and then even us as your external auditors.
Okay.
So really, meaning skepticism, meaning do you have a good enough understanding of knowing what the consequences might be or what further steps are needed to address any internal control findings or reports that you might receive.
Mhm.
Next slide, please. Okay, so right here, this is something that you might have seen before. This is a visualization of the 5 components of internal control, or the internal control cube. The 5 components of internal control, Mary will go over in more depth later, which is the control environment, risk assessment, control activities, information communication and monitoring activities. What I'd like to go over with you is the top side of the cube and the right side of the cube, what that represents. The top is something that I briefly mentioned before in the definition. Internal controls is a way for you to have effective and efficient operations, and this includes the safeguarding of assets. So if you have proper internal controls in place, most likely your organization will be running efficiently and effectively, and you'll be limiting your potential for loss, whether it's physical assets or monetary assets. So safeguarding of your assets. Then the next slide on top is internal control, effective internal controls in place to have reliable financial reporting. So when we look at internal controls, we often we mainly assess what goes on in your finance department, because our focus is on the financial reporting process. So meaning reliable financial reporting that is timely, that is accurate, that is not materially misstated as it relates to our audits. And then the last slide on the right, top right, is internal controls, proper internal controls in place, so you are actually complying with the applicable laws and regulations that affect the organization. So do you have processes and policies and procedures and processes in place that will enable the organization to stay in compliance with the various laws that affect the organization, but also something specifically that we look at are grant agreements, for example. Then across on the right-hand side of the cube, what this represents, it reads, if you can't read it, it reads entity level, division, operating unit, and function. What this represents is that internal controls literally have to be present throughout the whole organization. So the entity level is the city as a whole. And then you might take division and operating unit together. You can think of this as your various service areas, such as police, parks, finance, IT, your utilities, sewer, water. As you might imagine, you want to make sure that there are proper internal controls in place in your public utilities, in your sewer and water, because that might affect your water and sewer safety. This is the public uses of the public utilities. You've heard of hacks into utility system. So by having proper controls in place, you could prevent those type of occurrences from happening. Then, of course, finance has a lot of internal controls in place, and these could be by function, as you might think of cash disbursements, of processing long-term debt payments, of your safeguarding of your capital assets and your development of your capital assets. So, etc. Disbursements, receipting, those are all the various functions that would need internal controls.
How can a question, is the controlling person or auditor, for example, let's take the finance department, does he work for the finance department or does he report to the finance director? How do we separate, how do we keep him from commingling, for lack of a better word?
I believe in each department there is a finance specific person responsible, an employee responsible for finances that would report directly to their manager. But then the manager is in contact with the finance department. So there's a level of authority in each department.
Okay, good, thank you. So that person then, for example, in utilities, make sure that the proper funding is expended in the proper category, and so we don't commingle things. Okay.
Yeah. Yes, so they are responsible. They should be responsible for their own budget, their own revenue sources. They should have a great amount of knowledge, and then it's like you build that up to the finance department to then collect all of that knowledge together to present in your financials and your reporting.
Yeah, and that all works both ways. Now you're responsible to the policymakers, but also to the governmental agencies that we have to report to.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, Mary will go over that as well in more depth.
To make sure we're in compliance with the spending of those funds. Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
So yes, it's not just in the finance department that's responsible to make sure they're in compliance. If the utilities department gets a grant, they should know how they should be in compliance as well. Right. So that in that case, you have a good system of internal control.
All right.
Next slide. Mary will go over all of these different areas in more depth.
Okay. Thank you, Mary. You're up.
Thank you, Hong, and thank you, Mayor. I will be going over the individual components in a little more detail, starting with control environment. Control environment is probably the most involving one out of all the components for you as the city's Finance and Governance Committee. This component builds the foundation and sets the tone in the organization. And as you can see in the yellow bars on this slide, many of these phrases will sound familiar to you. And what they describe are the principles that make up this component, but also your roles as governance. So let's take a closer look. It is part of your responsibility to demonstrate commitment to integrity and ethical values. And common practice for this principle is for governance to set an example for the whole city by demonstrating the desired tone at the top. The city's mission statement, as well as the standards of conduct, are great tools to formally communicate the city's definition of integrity and ethical values. However, governance as well as upper management are to act and perform their daily responsibilities while adhering to those ideas and demonstrating the city's expectations to the rest of the city staff. Moving on to the next one, which is exercising oversight responsibility, or in other words, keeping a high-level overview of what's going on in the city without being directly involved with the day-to-day operations. In order to do this effectively, governance requires or has to have sufficient relevant experience and expertise to gain adequate insights to determine if the city's operations are aligned with your objectives. And appropriate structure and reporting lines are crucial in achieving that. Once those have been established, responsibilities and authorities can be delegated to individuals that are properly equipped with the necessary skills and experience to carry them out effectively. Governance and upper management should be committed to provide the resources such as training or outside consultants needed for its staff to perform their responsibilities as effectively as possible. The next principle is incredibly important, especially if the city is experiencing frequent turnovers in key management. Employee retention and succession planning are keys for avoiding competence gaps in situations of employees leaving unexpectedly or retiring. As governance, you might want to ask the following questions to make sure your answers to them are to your satisfaction. How does the city's employee retention look like, and how does it compare to other cities? What are you doing to encourage and increase employee retention, and has it been working? And are your current procedures and internal controls strong enough to go through transition without needing to reinvent the wheel? And then finally, enforcing accountability. By establishing performance measures, you set expectations and get everyone, but especially your management, on the same page in terms of where the city should be heading. The management, you should give management room to exercise their authority to guide the day-to-day activities, while the governing body should focus on periodic performance evaluations to measure the city's performance against the expectation. You might also want to consider any outside pressures that might be influencing the results or requiring for the expectations to be shifted.
Mary, excuse me. I think this is really important in order to establish and evaluate performances and measurements. It's something that is needed for employee retention, and to make sure that employee knows what they're doing, make sure that they're trained, make sure that you can measure that employee effectively, and also using the succession planning. Because if you go on vacation, you get ill, whatever, somebody needs to know basically what's happening in order to enforce the accountability part of it. I'm trying to kind of marry those together, Is that
Yes.
basically what you're sharing there, Mary?
Yes, that was a great summary. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Council members, any questions? Councilmember Turan?
Yes, thank you, Mayor.
Mhm.
Thank you, Mary. Quick question on the last one for enforcing accountability. Can you give us some examples of what outside pressures typically would look like for an organization like the City of Oxnard?
Excellent question. Thank you for that. Outside pressures could be, the first thing that came to mind when you asked that would be anything from your community regarding the budget, for instance, if you know they have specific focuses, if those are getting considered during the budgeting workshops and planning, that would be one of it. Something that is out of control, for instance, as another example, would be what we all went through last year, COVID. Because of that, a lot of I'm pretty sure the city's budgets had to be reconsidered and reprioritized. So just external factors like that. Did that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Councilman Basua, any? Or if not, we'll continue. then.
No, thank you, Mayor.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Mary.
Okay, thank you. So I realized there was a lot of information on the slide that you might want to refer back to in the future. So I recommend having a copy of this easily accessible to you. And that's what that little symbol at the bottom of the slide indicates. So those are our toolbox notifications for you. Okay.
Thank you.
Moving on to the next component, which is the risk assessment. The actual risk assessment process should be part of management's responsibility. And that includes specifying objectives, identifying and analyzing risks, assessing fraud risk, and identifying and analyzing any significant changes needed in the city's strategy. So yes, all the steps noted on the slide is actually part of management's responsibility. The governing body's role is to apply appropriate level of skepticism and challenge management's assessment of risks. Why, you might ask? It's to ensure that management's assessment has taken any significant shifts into consideration. And that includes internal as well as external information that might affect the city's activities. Risk assessments are important in allowing the city to change directions as needed to ensure it gets as close to the city's objectives as possible. And due to the nature of the variables, the risk assessment is not just a box to check off and forgotten until the next year, but rather an ongoing process that should be revisited after significant events to make sure the risk assessment and the strategy are still valid in the new conditions. Did you have any questions before I move on to the next slide?
Mary, on the risk assessment, that we think of monetary risks and so forth, but other risks, other items that we had to look at, like equipment and other items that are worth money. Is that what you're looking at too? Is that some of the what we look at, or is that more operational type?
The risk assessment looks at it as a whole, in a
As a
whole
whole.
picture. So that's a good question. So if you are aware that there are infrastructures that have been aging and might need attention in the years going forward, that is a risk that you might want to consider and make sure that it's getting addressed. Is that being planned for in the near future, and are reserves getting built up accordingly? So those are excellent questions that you will want to include in your discussion.
Like inventory control and those kind of things. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Council members, any questions? Okay. Thank you, Aaron.
Our next component is about control activities, and great examples for control activities are policies and procedures that have been put into place. And as Hong briefly went over earlier, internal controls can help prevent, detect, and correct errors, and therefore help ensure that day-to-day activities are performed as expected and are helping move the city move closer to its objectives on a daily basis. However, more often than not, these controls tend to be manual and time intensive, which makes them vulnerable to human error. There are options of automating them, but often involves time and resource investments to get them going. But a great recent example would be the city's ERP system that is currently going through its implementation stages. The investment in the new ERP system opens up opportunities for automating certain controls and making them more robust. But regardless whether controls are manual or automatic, the governing body is encouraged to perform periodic inquiries of management regarding how internal controls are utilized in significant risk areas identified, and help management consider and identify if any changes are needed. The governance body is also helping by approving any ordinances and resolutions that might strengthen the control activities. Do you have any questions on this one?
Council members, any questions on this item? Okay, if not, we'll continue.
So the next slide is on information and communication. Information and communication's main objective is to make sure information is available in the right format and at the right time. And communications involve internal as well as external parties. While internal communication is particularly focused on employees having access to the information needed to perform their day-to-day responsibilities and understanding their role in internal control, external communications are often related to reporting requirements to external parties, such as the community, the state, federal agencies, bond underwriters, etc. The Finance and Governance Committee's role is to ensure that communications are carried out and not overlooked, as well as the facilitation of any required steps to meet those requirements, like appointing your external auditors, for example, or your internal auditors.
Mhm. Okay,
Any questions in this one?
council members, any questions on this item? Okay, if not, just go and continue. Mhm.
Great. We have reached our last component, which is the monitoring activities. And as the name suggests, this component is to ensure that all other components, but especially the control activities, are functioning as intended through ongoing monitoring. Forms of monitoring include reviews and evaluations of the effectiveness of internal control. While that is the responsibility of management, the governing body should be aware of the results, such as any deficiencies and exceptions identified during those assessments. And also any corrective actions to address those deficiencies. Therefore, governance should be periodically communicating with management and the internal auditors and also the external auditors to evaluate the adaptability of the city's internal control to shifting and evolving factors. Other forms of monitoring include the internal audit function itself, the periodic corrective action plan, status reporting, as well as management's process in spot checking internal control procedures on an ongoing basis. The monitoring process acts as a detective control on its own, if you think about it. So overall, all 5 components are designed to be intertwined and operate in an integrated manner. And if effectively designed and functioning as intended, internal control can reduce the risk of the city not meeting its objectives to an acceptable level. Did you have any questions on this last component?
Mary, how often should we have the evaluations? You might have mentioned it, I missed it.
Management evaluation should be ongoing, so that should be rotating throughout the year.
Continuous.
Yes,
Okay.
and for the governance body, it should be something more periodic, maybe on a quarterly basis, maybe on a semi-annual basis. It is up for governance to, see what they're comfortable with.
Okay, thank you. Council members, any other questions on this monitoring activities? Okay, if not, we'll continue. Again.
So the internal controls are all very interesting. However, there are limitations and Eden will go over them with you next. Eden?
Thank you. Eden? No.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mary and Hong. Can you hear me well? Good.
Yes.
Yes. So good evening, members of the Finance and Governance Committee. Now that, Mary and Hong have discussed what internal control is, I'd like to pivot a little bit and talk about some of its limitations. But before I go there, I wanted to mention that the city has incorporated all of these internal control components into a document that you call Internal Control Integrated Framework, which is, I believe, was adopted by the City Council last year. So that document is actually very comprehensive. And I was just looking at it before we had this presentation, and I think it would be a good thing to go back to just to know, what the internal controls are in place in City of Oxnard. So it's not just theoretical, it's actually very practical.
Thank you for that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So anyway, limitations of internal control. No system, as you know, is perfect, but I think it helps for us to know what are some of those limitations so that we could be better equipped to avoid them. So the system's design in itself could be a limitation. One common deficiency in internal control system design is the lack of segregation of duties. There are 3 functions that should be segregated when assigning tasks. Custody of assets, being able to authorize the use of those assets, and record keeping of assets. these three functions should not, and I repeat that, should not be assigned to only one person. Lack of segregation of duties often provides an opportunity for employees to commit fraud. Just say, for example, a person who receives cash or checks from customers can also record these cash received from customers into your system, and also can create credit memos to customers. Just imagine the opportunity that this creates for that person. He or she can now divert an incoming payment from a customer and cover that theft with a matching credit to the customer's account. And it will be very difficult to find that.
And how do you control that? Through what? Through a receipts or cash, or and then a second person looks at it?
Yeah, so the control there should be separating the tasks to different people or somebody else reviewing them. So having custody of the assets, receiving that cash should not be assigned to person who will be able to record that in your system. So there has to be a separation.
Good. Councilmember Tehran has a question.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Eden, for that. I have two questions. One, it sounds like, I think we had used this example before of the separation of duties where the general public may be able to relate to a small fundraiser or like a snack bar at a Little League game or something where there's never one person who's in charge of the cash box, and the person who receives the cash may not be the same person who deposits the cash or writes down the deposit slips. Those would be separated duties in order to ensure that there's never just one set of eyes on any of those responsibilities. Is that correct?
That is exactly what I'm trying to say. You said it right on.
Thank you. And my second thing then along those lines is with a city like Oxnard, where it's been fairly publicly stated that often we have departments that maybe are a little spread thin or have people wearing a number of hats. Is that a recommendation to look at the types of duties that they have to ensure that we have separation of duties to make sure that's a robust control that we have?
I totally agree with that. It has to be when somebody leaves, for example, and that job has to be performed by somebody else, the management should take a look at how the separation of duties is now going to be affected. So that is something that has to be looked at on a day-to-day basis. I mean, periodically, especially when things change.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Councilman Basua.
Thank you, Mayor. Eden, I do have a question. When you are auditing the city and you mentioned cash receivables and people are taking payments and credit, do you actually interview the employees to see what their process is and what kind of processes the city has? And if you see a deficiency, is that something that you write up?
Thank you, Councilmember Basua. That's a very good question because now I can say that we actually do that. Yes, we do interviews of key personnel who have responsibilities in handling cash, particularly those that receive cash and also those that have authority in dispersing the funds of the city. And yes, we do, if we find any deficiencies in those controls, we would write them up.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eden. Okay, good questions.
Yeah, very good questions. And the other limitation that's in this slide is rigidly designed controls. When you have rigid controls, employees using them may become frustrated and apathetic about enforcing them. and that doesn't allow you to be to actually have a good control, because people don't implement them anymore because they get frustrated. Let's take a look at an example. Let's say that management requires a report to be generated and reviewed every day. That is a good control, and it was working well when there was a person who was actually reviewing it, until that person who was assigned to do that review left, and it's now assigned to another person. This is something that you have mentioned, Councilmember Turan. Another person is doing the work, and that person is already overloaded with other work. So more often than not, the reports generated are not being reviewed. And in time, nobody bothers to run the reports anymore because they know that no one is going to review it. In that case, you have to be flexible when circumstances change. If maybe that, daily report can be run every week now, so that somebody is actually still reviewing it.
Should that procedure be written down so that the next person that comes in follows that procedure in order to continue with the proper reporting or proper exercise on that particular item that they're working on?
That is correct. We had recommended before, like desk procedures, so that each person will know what they're supposed to be doing, given different tasks.
Great. Okay. Thank you.
Mary had also mentioned something which is not in this slide. Human error is a source of deficiencies. Obviously, mistakes happen, and when controls are manual, mistakes happen more often. Also, errors occur more often when the person who was assigned to do the task do not understand how the control system works, or maybe a wrong person was assigned to do the task, maybe somebody who is not qualified to do it. That's, exacerbates the problem with human error.
And that's where the training comes in too, and which is extremely important. I think
That is correct.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. When two or more people who are responsible to be checking on each other, instead, they collude to circumvent the system. That is another limitation, because the control is now eliminated. Two people are actually supposed to check each other, but they don't do that anymore. They just, cover for each other, which is not a good thing. The last one that I wanted to mention is management override of controls. Management obviously has authority to override controls. And when they do that, their subordinates may not question their decision. So sometimes that override of control is done for the sake of convenience, or maybe it's in an emergency situation, so in that case, it may be okay. However, this is something that you need to be aware of, that this could also present an opportunity for fraud. So that is something that, as auditors, we are always aware of, and as governance, you should also be aware of.
Yeah, Councilmember Turan.
Thank you. Eden, regarding that last point you made about management kind of overrides of controls in emergency or unique situations, it seems that if we need to have flexibility, that may require that on occasion, someone in the decision position will be able to make those types of overrides. However, is it a best practice or a recommendation to review when overrides happen to be sure that we know why it happened and we can correct the reason, if possible, that it needed to be overridden, and to not make it a regular occurrence? Is that the best practice? Is that a recommendation? I'm just wondering about that.
That is a good idea to actually have another level, I guess, of review or check of anything that management is overriding. And so there has to be like some kind of a hierarchy of who checks what. Like, for example, if the CFO had to override a control because of some emergency situation or any particular situation that has to be approved by, say, for example, your deputy city manager. So there has to be some kind of check and balance for that one as well.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. And I think that the reason I bring that up is, in my head, there are two potential scenarios. I'm sure there are more, but two come to mind. One where if we're consistently seeing a need for overriding controls, we should possibly consider reviewing and evaluating that control to see why it keeps having to be overridden and correct the root issue that's causing that to happen again and again. The other scenario that comes to mind is one that you brought up earlier, where you have two people who are either very lax or have intentional fraud going on. And if one of them is at a management level and we're doing these overrides that nobody's checking, then we have a potential for one of those situations of fraud to occur. So I appreciate you sharing that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And your comments are really right on to, on the ball. I love it. Okay, I think we can go to the next slide.
Okay.
So let's talk about compliance. Now, I think we are at 6 o'clock now. Is it okay if we're gonna go over a little bit?
Yeah, you have a couple more slides. Go ahead and, yes.
Okay. So as you know, cities are subject to many laws and regulations, and actually I'm not really sure how you keep track of all of them. Just in 2021, California passed like hundreds of bills. The cities and counties add their own set of laws and regulations, and you also enter into various contracts and agreements, whether it's for construction, employment, loans, or grants. In a financial audit, we are concerned with laws, regulations, contracts, and grant agreements that have a material effect on your financial statements. So this reduces the number of laws, regulations that we have to be aware of, but there's still a lot. For example, there's certain sections of California government code and actually your municipal code that relate to deposits and investments. Those are something that we look at all the time. Other examples that relate to like payroll expenses and payroll related liabilities, like labor laws, any contracts that you have with your unions or agreements with your unions, pension documents and all of that, those are all related to payroll expenses. And then there's also laws, regulations, contracts that relate to leases, loans, municipal bonds, restriction of funds, et cetera, et cetera. And then the final thing that we like to look at a lot is agreements and contracts related to grants from state and federal agencies. So, and part of this is related to your single audit. In addition to the single audit, there's also state and other government agencies that conduct compliance audits. For example, there's gas tax audits, Department of Transportation, et cetera. Your system of internal control over compliance is part of the city's internal control integrated framework. Part of that system is for management to have a good understanding of the various laws and regulations that are passed by the state and the feds, as well as those contracts and agreements that the city enters into. So that's management's role. The audit committee's role, and Mary, can you go to the next slide? The audit committee's role when it comes to compliance is mainly oversight, to ensure that appropriate policies and procedures are in place and make sure that they are being implemented. You also have a role to be informed of investigations and audit findings, and be able to engage with legal counsel if it is needed. Our role as auditors is to provide you with a report identifying any instances of non-compliance. We offer no opinion as far as your compliance with laws and regulations, but if we happen to find instances of non-compliance, we're supposed to report them to you. Because of the number of laws and regulations, contracts and agreements that impact your financial statements, we rely on management to inform us of the compliance requirements that affect the audit. Can I answer any questions at this point?
Any questions? No, that's really an important role right there. That's,
All right, next slide, please.
That's the last one, right? Mhm.
This is the last one.
Mhm.
So this is about audit findings. Internal control findings are reported by us, your auditors, when controls are missing or not in place, when controls are not properly designed, or when controls that have been put in place and properly designed are not implemented. We classified findings into 4 different types: material weakness, significant deficiency, non-compliance, and best practice. You've heard of this before. What I wanted to present today is how do we determine the difference between a material weakness and a significant deficiency. So the significant deficiency is less severe than a material weakness. So the one major consideration is the quantitative effect of the deficiency. So let's, for example, if you have a city that does not reconcile its bank statements, if we're talking about a general checking account where there's hundreds and thousands of transactions that go on throughout the year, that probably is a material weakness. If we're talking about, say, a savings account that doesn't have a lot of activity, or a payroll account that has maybe a 0 balance at the end, maybe it will be a significant deficiency. So it just depends on how much activity is going on, as well as the balances that may be impacted. Another consideration is the prevalence of the deficiency. How often is the deficiency occurring? When we do our tests, sometimes we find exceptions, right? If we have a sample of 40 and you have 20 exceptions, that could be a material weakness. If there are only 2 exceptions, maybe it could be a significant deficiency. So that's one of the things that we look at. Finally, is it a deficiency of a key control? A key control is something that is a must-have, otherwise other controls may not work. Examples of these are segregation of duties, bank reconciliations, physical security of assets, and authorization of cash disbursements. Deficiencies related to those are usually considered material weaknesses. And then we report instances of non-compliance that have a significant impact on your financial statements. When it comes to compliance, it's pretty straightforward. It's either you complied or you did not comply. So there's not a lot of gray area there. Best practice findings are merely recommendations for improvement and are optional. They usually come from organizations such as the GFOA or the Government Finance Officers Association or the AICPA, CalCPA, or the State Controller's Office. The audit committee's role is to understand how these findings impact the city's operations and how they are being addressed by city management. So our role is to report them to you. So let me open the floor to any questions about audit findings or any other topics that we have covered tonight.
Council members, any questions? Well, if not, I just want to thank Hong, Eden, and Mary for excellent presentation. And I think this training is really, it's coming all together now. Once you look at the session 1, 2, and 3, and potentially maybe by the 4th, we'll know a little something.
Well, something more, yes. So thank you so much for
Thank you.
the time here. You know, we just completed this third one, and the fourth one will be a risk assessment in November. So thank you, and we're looking forward to that.
Thank you so much. An excellent presentation.
Good
Thank-
evening, everyone.
Thank you. Mhm.
Bye.
Okay. Okay, let me see, committee members. That's the last item that we have. Any items for future agendas? Councilmember Tehran?
Yes, thank you, Mayor.
Mhm.
I actually do have 3 items here that I'd like to request from staff.
Okay.
2 of them are related, so I'll do those 2 quickly first. The first is something that was brought to my attention a while back, and I've looked into it a little bit and spoken with some staff about it, but it's regarding trash, litter, and cleanliness around our multi-unit housing structures. And so it'd be apartments, duplexes, etc. And I'd like to make a request for a report from staff on, do we have existing ordinances around this? And do we have strategies for improvement, or can we get updates on things that might be needed? I don't know if that would fall under this committee, but you know, I would just like to request staff take a look at that and run it through the appropriate committee if this would not be the right one.
In general, yeah, okay,
Yes.
okay.
All right. The next one is also around trash, and it's because of the costs that we have in the great work that's happening around our 311 program and our green team that we've been seeing. But it is something I want to look at, which is illegal dumping throughout the city. Because of the pandemic, I recognize that what we formerly had as neighborhood cleanups, where a neighborhood council would coordinate a cleanup for their neighborhood, where they'd bring large roll-off containers and people could bring large bulky items out. Those have not happened because of the pandemic, understandably. But I'm wondering what we're currently doing right now to address illegal dumping and large bulky items. What can we do, or what are we doing for mitigation of illegal dumping? And is there anything we can do for removing any kind of barriers around access or cost for taking things to Del Norte? So I'd like to request something for that. Hopefully that would come through this committee, but if it's another appropriate committee, I appreciate that too.
I'm sure that those 2 items, they're under environmental and also code compliance. Potentially, we could bring that up with the Public Works Committee, but go ahead. You
Appreciate that. And if there's a cost involved, I'd like to hear about that too. So
Uh-huh.
the last thing is regarding parking signs in our public facing parking lots. So any service center, such as the utility center that we have or planning over on C Street, I'm wondering if we would be able to look into instituting a parking sign program for expectant parents or family parking. You may have seen this at private parking lots, where they have parking spaces reserved for young families or new parents. And I'm just wondering if any municipalities have done that, and if that's something we could look at as well.
Yeah, I'm sure I see Sherry writing quite a bit with the computer, you know, so. So we have, want to find out about litter around an ordinance around apartments, the 30-yard containers that are used for neighborhood cleanups, and also the parking signs for special parking signs for individuals, you know.
Correct.
Your council member will take a look at all of those. We'll get back to you on this.
And
Thank you very much, Ms. Kleen. And those are all of my items, Mayor. Thank you for the time on that.
no, that's okay. Councilman Basua? No? Betsy, have anything you want to share?
No, thank you. Just appreciate all the questions and the interaction with the presentation that Edie and Payne gave. It's good to have the full engagement of the committee. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. And we want to thank Lourdes, our interpreter, and we are adjourned. And we'll be back at 6:45 with the Community Public Safety and Housing Development. Thank you so much. So we're adjourned. Mhm.